My wife used to say that the truest measure of a man isn't how he treats the people who can lift him up, but how he treats the people he's decided don't matter. June was right about most things, and she was right about that. I've spent the back half of my life watching people sort the room into who counts and who doesn't, and I've noticed something. The ones who get it wrong almost always get it wrong about me. My name is Lewis Hartman. I'm 67 years old, and I drive a 1998 Ford F-250 with 240,000 miles on it, and a tailgate that you have to lift up a quarter inch before it'll latch. It used to be dark green. The sun in central Ohio doesn't care what color your truck started out, and after 26 years, it's settled into something the kid at the parts store once politely called vintage. I keep it because it runs. Because June liked the way the bench seat let her sit close to me on long drives. And because I have never in my life understood the appeal of paying somebody to look at what you own and form an opinion about it. I wear clean clothes, pressed when the occasion calls for it. I am not a man who shows up at a nice dinner looking like he wandered in off a fishing boat, and I want that on the record, because later in this story some people are going to make assumptions about a man in simple clothes, and I'd like you to understand from the start that simple is not the same as careless. My shirts are ironed, my shoes are shined, I just don't buy things to be seen in them. I live on Coldwater Road in a town called Ashford, about 40 minutes outside Columbus. I bought the house 31 years ago when Lily was 2 and June was pregnant with our son, who we lost at 11 days old, and whose name I still don't say out loud to strangers. The maples on our street were planted by men who are mostly gone now. My neighbor Sam Petrosky, who spent 40 years driving a route for the county, and who makes the worst horseradish I have ever put in my mouth, leaned on my fence one Sunday last spring, and told me I was the only man he knew who had money, and acted like he was waiting for it to show up. I told him I didn't have money. He laughed. I laughed. We talked about his tomatoes for half an hour, and I went inside. Here is what Sam Petrosky doesn't know. What the men at the diner where I get my coffee don't know. What the salesman at the Ford dealership didn't know last fall when he tried, gently, to walk me towards something newer, and I smiled and told him the F-250, and I had an understanding. I own a company called Granite Ridge Holdings. Logistics, commercial real estate, a controlling share in a regional bank, distribution interests across the Midwest and into Canada. It's built in layers, holding companies inside holding companies. The kind of structure where my name shows up on a piece of paper in a vault somewhere and nowhere else. There's no profile of me in any magazine, no building with my name on it, no gala where I stand at a podium and tell a room full of people in tuxedos how I did it. I built it that way on purpose, over 40 years, getting up at 4 in the morning and going to bed long after the news ended, and I never once mistook being noticed for being worth something. Granite Ridge is worth a little over $2.5 billion. I drive a truck with a busted tailgate latch, and I plant beans along the back fence every May, and I would not trade one ordinary morning of my life for a single thing those people in tuxedos have. Now let me tell you about my daughter. Lily Hartman is 33 years old, and she is the best thing I have ever done with my time on this earth, and that includes the company. She has her mother's stubbornness and her mother's laugh, the kind that starts in the back of her throat and takes a room hostage before she knows it's happening. When she was 8, she organized the kids on our street into a strike against me because I'd shortened their summer bedtime by half an hour. She drew up a list of grievances on a poster board. I read it standing in my own driveway and I thought, Lord, I have made something that is going to be a force in this world. I was right. She runs a little design studio in Columbus now. Branding, packaging, that kind of work, the sort of thing I don't fully understand but that other people apparently pay real money for. She built it herself, with her own hands, on a loan from an actual bank that she paid back early. She does not know that I could have written the check. That was the whole point. 3 years ago she brought home a man named Garrett Wexler. I want to be fair to Garrett, so let me reach for the most generous thing I can say about him. Garrett Wexler is the kind of man who, within 20 minutes of meeting you, will find a way to mention 3 places he has been that you have not. He's 36, tall, with the easy good looks of a man who has never once worried whether he's the most important person in the room, because he has simply decided that he is. He wears watches that cost more than my truck and suits that fit him the way a magazine fits an idea. Inside of half an hour at our first dinner he had told me about his graduate degree, his golf handicap, and a week he'd spent skiing in Aspen with people whose last names I was apparently supposed to recognize. I nodded. I said, "Sounds like a fine time." I poured him more iced tea. 6 months after he started dating Lily, Garrett Wexler was named CEO of a company called Halcyon Freight Systems. Now stay with me because this is the part that matters. Halcyon Freight is a subsidiary of Granite Ridge Holdings. 280 employees, a clean balance sheet, contracts moving freight up and down the Eastern Corridor. A real company doing real work. Garrett got that job through a search that looked, from the outside, completely ordinary. An executive recruiting firm. 3 rounds of interviews, reference checks, a board vote. What nobody knew, what Garrett still does not know to this day, is that I watched every minute of it. I had an arrangement with that recruiting firm that went back 15 years. I read his references myself. I sat in a room I wasn't supposed to be in and watched recordings of his interviews. I approved his salary. I signed off on the appointment with a pen June gave me for our 20th anniversary, and then I drove home and changed into my work clothes and spent the afternoon putting in fence posts. That night Garrett texted me. "Big day. Just got named CEO. Lily's over the moon." I wrote back, "Hard work pays off. Proud of you, son." Then I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and ate a bowl of cereal standing up at the counter, the way I do when nobody's watching. I want to be honest about something. I gave that man a real chance. I am not somebody who decides about a person in the first 10 minutes and then spends the next 10 years collecting evidence. I have hired and let go and promoted and mentored more people than I can count, and the one thing I've learned is that first impressions lie about as often as they tell the truth. People grow. People surprise you. I have been wrong, and being wrong about a person in the right direction is one of the few genuine pleasures left to a man my age. Garrett did not surprise me. What he did instead was confirm himself, slowly, the way a slow leak confirms itself, one day at a time. It started small. At a company event, his company, he believed, he walked me around a room, and a young vice president, with a great deal of product in his hair, asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Garrett said, "Oh, he's retired. Lily's dad." And then, with a hand on my shoulder, "Get yourself something to eat, Lewis. We'll catch up." And just like that I was set adrift. An old man holding a club soda moved along like furniture being repositioned for better flow. I smiled. I moved along. I filed it away in the same place I file everything I'm not ready to act on yet. But the moment that actually turned the key was a Tuesday in March. I'd stopped by Halcyon's offices to handle something quietly through one of my holding company people. A man named who I won't name, because he's still there and good at his job. I was in the building, unremarkable as always, an old man in a clean barn coat that nobody looked at twice. And as I came around the corner near the executive suites, I heard Garrett's voice. He was talking to someone, another executive, from the sound of it. And he was talking about me. "My father-in-law?" he said, and I heard the smile in it, the particular smile of a man performing for an audience. Picture every dad joke about a guy who won't replace his lawnmower, drives a truck older than my assistant. I keep waiting for Lily to inherit something so I can finally talk her into a real house, but I think the old man's whole estate is that truck and a paid-off ranch in the middle of nowhere. A pause. Laughter, his and the other man's. "I love him, I do. He's just, he's the kind of guy you have to manage. The kind of guy you have to manage." I stood very still in that corridor for a moment. Then I turned around and walked back out to my truck, and I sat in the parking lot with my hands on the wheel, and I did not feel angry. Exactly. I felt the way you feel when a doctor finally names the thing you've suspected for a while. There's almost a relief in it. The waiting is over. You know what you're dealing with now. I drove home. I made dinner. I didn't tell Lily. I should explain why I never met Garrett's parents until what I'm about to tell you. Garrett and Lily got married at the courthouse downtown with a small reception, after at a restaurant we all liked. 20 people. My idea of a good time. Garrett's parents, Preston and Vivian Wexler, did not come. They'd been living in London for the better part of a decade. Preston did something in finance that I never got a straight answer about. And they sent their regrets and a very large arrangement of flowers and a card that managed to be both warm and faintly disappointed at the same time, which I'd later learn was the family talent. They came back to the States about 4 months ago and bought a house in Shaker Heights, the kind of address that does a lot of talking on your behalf. And so it happened that I did not lay eyes on the people my daughter had married into until a dinner this past April, 3 years after the wedding. Lily called me on a Sunday. "Dad," she said, Garrett's parents are finally back and they want to do a real dinner. All of us. Will you come? And then, gently, the way you bring up something delicate, maybe wear the gray jacket. Vivian's a little formal. I'll wear the gray jacket, I said. And I did. I had it pressed. I shined my shoes. I wore the watch June gave me, which is a good watch, a quiet one, the kind you'd have to know to notice. I am telling you this because I know how this looks. An old man showing up to dinner with rich people, and I want it understood that I did not show up looking for sympathy. I showed up looking like a man who respected his daughter enough to iron his shirt. I drove the F-250 up to Shaker Heights on a Saturday evening, with the windows down, because the air conditioning had its own opinions, and I parked it on the street in front of a house that probably cost more than the entire town of Ashford. Garrett opened the door before I knocked, glanced past me at the truck, and something flickered across his face that he covered quickly. "Lewis," he said, "you made it." Preston Wexler shook my hand like he was testing the firmness of a melon. Vivian Wexler looked at my jacket, my shoes, my watch, taking an inventory and arriving at a number, and the number disappointed her. "Lewis," she said, "we've heard so little about you." Which is a thing you say when you want a man to know exactly where he stands. The house was beautiful in the way of houses that are trying very hard. Everything was new. Everything matched. There was art on the walls that had clearly been chosen by someone whose job it was to choose art, and not a single book that looked like it had ever been opened. Lily hugged me at the door and whispered, "Thank you for coming," and I held her a beat longer than I needed to, because she looked tired in a way I didn't like. Dinner was lamb. It was, I'll admit, excellent. The conversation was a long performance about places and people and the cost of things, and I sat there and ate and said, "Is that right?" And "Well, how about that?" and watched. Vivian asked me twice what I'd done before I retired, and twice I said, "I worked in logistics mostly," which is true, and twice she nodded the way you nod at a man who has told you he collects stamps. And then, over coffee, Preston Wexler reached down beside his chair and brought up a leather folder and slid it across the table toward me. "Lewis," he said, "we wanted to have you here in person for this, because family business should be done face to face." He folded his hands. "Garrett's at a turning point. He's outgrown Halcyon. Frankly, he's been carrying that company. He's ready to build something of his own. We've put together an opportunity, and we're all in. Vivian and I are putting in what we can. But these things take capital, and they take faith from family." I opened the folder. I read it slowly, because I read everything slowly, a habit that has saved me more money than I could tell you. Inside was a proposal, a founding partnership, they called it, for Garrett's new venture. And the capital structure laid it out plainly. They wanted Lily's trust. I should tell you about the trust. When June died, 11 years ago now, on a Thursday in October, and I still can't smell hospital coffee without losing a piece of the day, she left Lily a trust, $412,000, set up in Lily's name, payable when she turned 30. It was real money, June's money, from her teaching pension, and a small inheritance of her own and 20 years of refusing to let me pay for things she felt she should pay for herself. It went through probate, which means it's a matter of public record if you know where to look. And somebody, Preston, I'd guess, with his finance background and his nose for other people's money, had gone and looked. The proposal wanted Lily's $412,000 pledged as collateral. And then, on the next page, it wanted me. It wanted me to put up the Coldwater Roadhouse, paid off, as additional security. Given, the document said, that Mr. Hartman's primary asset is unencumbered real estate. His participation would demonstrate the family's unified commitment. They had appraised my house. They had it down to the dollar. They wanted the old man with the truck and the ranch in the middle of nowhere to mortgage the home his wife died in, so their son could build something to put his name on. I closed the folder. "That's a lot of faith," I said. "It's an investment," Preston said, smiling. "In Garrett. In all of us." I looked at my daughter. Lily was sitting very straight, her hands in her lap, and I knew that face. I'd known that face since she was 4 years old. She didn't want this. She hadn't known the house part was coming. She'd been told, I'd find out later, that this dinner was about support, about the family being behind Garrett, and the specifics of whose money was being pledged had been kept vague until the folder hit the table. She was looking at me with her mother's eyes, and what she was saying with them was, "I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know how to stop this." I smiled at her. Then I looked at Garrett, who hadn't said a word through any of it, who was watching me with the careful patience of a man who believes he's about to win. "Let me think about it," I said. These things take time. Preston's smile didn't move, but something behind it relaxed. He'd expected resistance. He'd gotten an old man buying time. To him, those were the same thing. I thanked them for the lamb, which truly was excellent, and I hugged my daughter, and I drove the F-250 back downtown to Ashford with the windows open and the spring night coming in cold, and somewhere around the Delaware County line I started, very quietly, to laugh. Because here is what Garrett Wexler did not know. What Preston and Vivian Wexler, congratulating themselves over the last of their wine in Shaker Heights, did not know. I wrote Garrett's employment contract. Personally. Every clause. 3 years ago, when the board voted to make him CEO of a company I owned, the agreement he signed without reading carefully enough contained a fiduciary duty and non-compete provision that I had drafted long before Garrett Wexler ever said the word aspen in my kitchen. It was a clause I'd written for exactly one kind of man, the kind who stands in the middle of a house that belongs to someone else and decides he must own it because he's the one standing there. I'd been patient for 3 years. I could be patient a little longer. The next morning I made one phone call, not to Garrett, not to Preston, to 3 men on the Halcyon Freight Board who had known me a long time and who understood that when I called them directly on a Sunday, it was not to discuss the weather. Run a full audit, I told them. Standard scope, but I want everything. Start tomorrow. Then I made coffee and went out to look at where the beans were coming up. Garrett texted me on Wednesday, "Hey Lewis, any thoughts on the proposal? Big things ahead, exciting stuff." I waited 4 hours. Then I wrote, "Still reading it through, son. I'm a slow reader." He sent back a thumbs up. I imagine he showed it to his father. The audit took 11 days. When the report came across my desk, I sat with it a long time, not because it surprised me, but because I wanted to be sure, completely sure. Before a man does what I was about to do, he owes it to everyone, even the guilty, to be sure. Garrett Wexler had been building his new venture for 9 months. Not from his kitchen table on the weekends. From inside Halcyon Freight. On company time, company laptops, company servers. He'd been using Halcyon's client list. Relationships the company had spent 15 years, and a great deal of money building, to quietly line up customers for a business that would compete directly with one of Granite Ridge's own subsidiaries. He'd had meetings about it during work hours. He'd sent the proposals from his Halcyon email and then deleted them, not understanding that on a company server, nothing is ever really deleted. It just moves to a place you don't have the keys to. Every contact, every document, every minute of it was a direct violation of the clause he'd signed without reading. And all of it was now sitting in a binder on my kitchen table. He had forgotten the most basic thing there is. You cannot build a house in secret inside another man's house. He owns the walls. He owns the foundation. He owns the ground you're standing on while you draw up your blueprints, and one day he simply walks down the hall and opens the door. On a Thursday morning, I took the gray jacket out of the closet again, and a charcoal suit I hadn't worn since June's funeral, and I dressed the way I dress when something needs to be true and undeniable. I drove the F-250 up to Halcyon Freight, and I parked in the reserved space out front, the one with the small brass placard that reads Granite Ridge Holdings, the Holdings. The space Garrett Wexler had driven past 3 times a week for 3 years and never once wondered about. I walked into the executive conference room, and I sat down at the head of the table. The 3 board members sat to my left. 2 attorneys sat to my right. The audit binder sat in front of me, closed. And in about 4 minutes, Garrett Wexler was going to walk through that door, believing he'd been called in for a routine quarterly review. I straightened my jacket. I waited. The door opened. He came in the way he came into every room, like he was doing it a favor. And then he saw the board members and the lawyers and the binder, and he saw me sitting at the head of his table in a suit he'd never seen, and I watched the understanding arrive on his face, the way water arrives in a basement. Slowly at first, then all at once. The reserved parking space, the contract, the audit, his father's confident smile, the folder sliding across the table. 3 years of standing in a house he thought he owned. It all landed on him at the same moment, and the silence in that room lasted a full 10 seconds, and I let every one of them sit there. "Sit down, son," I said. He sat. "I'm going to say this once," I said, "and I want you to understand something first. I'm not angry. Anger is for men who got blindsided. I saw this coming the morning you slid a CEO title across a recruiting firm's desk without ever asking yourself why the search went so smooth." I opened the binder. Halcyon Freight is owned by Granite Ridge Holdings. Granite Ridge Holdings is owned by me. has been for the entire time you've worked here. The salary you earn, the title you introduce yourself with, the whole identity you've built. It exists because I built the company underneath it, and I handed it to you because I wanted to believe I was wrong about you. For 9 months you used what I gave you to build a knife, and you pointed it at the people who fed you. I closed the binder. The clause in your contract covers every single thing in this report. My attorneys are prepared to take it as far as it needs to go. Every ounce of the confidence he'd walked in with was gone. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a young man a long way from home. He looked at the board members, nothing. He looked at the lawyers, nothing. He looked back at me. But I said, I'm not interested in burning you down. I'm interested in the truth being on the table for once. So here's how this goes. You resign today, quietly, professionally. Your reputation walks out of here intact, and this stays inside these walls. Or we go the other way, and everything in this binder becomes part of a record that anyone can read. And then I saw something I hadn't expected, and I'll be honest with you, it touched me a little. Not defiance. Not the scramble of a man trying to talk his way out. Shame. The real kind. The quiet kind that only shows up when a man finally sees himself clearly and doesn't care for the view. I'll resign, he said. The words seemed to cost him something. Good. The expensive ones are the only ones worth anything. I stood up and buttoned my jacket and picked up the binder. At the door I stopped. One more thing, I said. Your father's proposal. Lily's trust, the house. I gave it about 1 second of my time. I looked back at him. My attorneys moved Lily's trust this morning, out of any structure your family could ever touch, into an account in her name alone, that requires her signature and nobody else's. The money your father wanted to pledge no longer exists in the place he thinks it does. As for my house, I almost smiled. Tell your parents I'd sooner mortgage my own gravestone, and tell your mother the lamb was excellent. I drove home in the F-250. It complained at the first turn of the key, the way it always does, like an old dog getting up off the porch. The tailgate rattled. The cracked side mirror caught the last of the afternoon sun as I came up Coldwater Road and turned into my driveway. I sat in the truck for a minute, just sat. 31 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, and knowing exactly who I was the whole time. I put my hand flat on the dash. All right, old girl, I said. Then I went inside and called my daughter. She came over 20 minutes later and found me at the kitchen table, the one June and I bought at an estate sale the year we married, with the burn mark from a Thanksgiving I'd rather not get into. I'd made tea. 2 cups. She sat down across from me and looked at my face for a long moment, reading it the way she's read it since she was a little girl, like a map she's known her whole life. And I told her, all of it, the company, the structure, how Garrett got the job, the clause I wrote before either of us knew his name, the audit, the boardroom, the trust already moved, already hers. I laid it all out quietly on the table between us. When I finished, she was silent for a long time. She turned her teacup around and around without drinking it. Then she looked up at me, and her eyes were full, and she asked the only question that mattered, the one I'd been carrying the answer to since the day she was born. Dad, she said, why didn't you ever tell me? I looked down at my tea. I looked out the window at the dark yard, at the places along the fence where the beans were coming up. I looked back at my daughter, at her mother's eyes and her face, at the woman who built her own business on a bank loan she paid back early because she didn't know, because I made sure she didn't know, that her father could have handed her the world on a plate. Because I wanted you to build your own life, I said, not stand inside one I built and call it yours. I never wanted you to look at me and see a bank. I wanted you to see your dad. I reached across the table. And look what you made of yourself when you thought you were on your own. That's not the trust talking. That's not my money. That's you. I'd have robbed you of that if I'd told you. I couldn't do it. She cried then, and I held her hand across that old burned table, and I let her, and I didn't say anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. I thought for just a moment about Preston Wexler in his beautiful house full of unopened books, getting a phone call he was not prepared for. About Vivian setting down her wine. About Garrett standing in a kitchen in Shaker Heights, trying to find the words to explain to his parents how the old man with the truck, the one you had to manage, the one whose whole estate was a ranch in the middle of nowhere, turned out to be the only person at that dinner table they should never, not for 1 second, have decided didn't count. I thought about all of it, and then I let it go because none of it was sitting at my kitchen table. The only thing in this world that has ever mattered to me was right across from me, holding a cup of tea going cold, her eyes red, smiling through it. Some men don't look like much. That's the whole trick of it. And the ones who mistake quiet for empty always find out what was in the room with them the entire time. I went to bed early that night, and I slept like a man with nothing on his conscience, because that's exactly what I was.